Good morning. I want to live in a happy world. How about you? I want to live in a safe world. Okay, anybody? Okay. I want to live in a world where my children and grandchildren can look forward to a better quality of life. I want to live in a world where every child can believe and expect the best of people who are in authority over them, whether they are politicians, policemen, preachers, or parents. I want to live in a world that is so full of grace that kindness is what's normal. Now I realize I've set the bar pretty high, very high expectation. And some of these types of happiness have been harder for some people to pursue than others, often divided along lines of race. We have to talk about race. It is my contention that we have stayed away from the conversations about race for far too long. And it's time for us to engage that so that we can move into a better, safer, happier world. So today, I may make you just a wee bit uncomfortable. You know, look at the person to your left or to your right, touch them on the knee like we do as good Southern people, and say, it's going to be okay. I don't want to make you uncomfortable today for the purpose of causing harm. What I want to do is make you just uncomfortable enough that you will think about the way you think, and that you will also think about the way you act. We all watch TV, and current events have shown us clearly that the racial divide in America is probably greater than it has been in any time during the last at least 50 years. So much so that we, the people, can no longer afford to bury our heads in the sand and pretend that there's not a problem, or that if we ignore it, it will go away, or that someone else needs to fix it. So I'll tell you a little bit about my story. I was a child 50 years ago during the civil rights era. I didn't quite understand why I had to sit in the balcony at my hometown movie theater, or why my parents and I couldn't go to the big concession stand or the really nice bathrooms down near the lobby, but I knew at some level that it had something to do with the color of my skin. I'm not sure anybody ever actually told me that, but I understood at a very young age that there were certain limitations that would be placed on my life because I was black. During those days, my teachers, my classmates, the people that I went to church with, and the people that I interacted with pretty much on a daily basis were all a variety of beige and brown. This was normal in my young world. Most communities were still segregated. That separation permeated not only schools and churches, but also daily social and even some commercial transactions. It was mainly on Saturday trips into town with my parents that I would see the other children. Children who didn't look like me, with parents who didn't look like mine. Their faces seemed a little bit strange to me. And as children, we would exchange curious glances and stares, sometimes smiling, sometimes sticking out our tongues. But we would each grab hold of our parents' hands and move closer to them as we passed on the sidewalk. When I went to the 4th grade, mandatory desegregation put me face to face in the same educational spaces with these other children every day. And as often happens with children, we became friends. As relationships emerged and grew, I learned that they really were a whole lot like me in a lot of ways. But at the same time, I continued to see how differently we were treated in society. How the department store sales lady would follow me and my beige and brown friends around, kind of giving us the evil eye, but was busy with other things when I was with a white friend. How my 7th grade homeroom teacher showed visible signs of discomfort when she made her random references to the Negro children in the class. And even the look on my own parents' faces the first time I told them that I wanted to go home with a white friend after school. These were cultural transmissions that I picked up on while growing up black in America that caused me to think very deeply about race, even at a young age, because I perceived that before I was seen as anything else, I was seen as black, and that carried certain implications. I was always inspired by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, in which he said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." And I was about the right age, so I always felt like he was talking about me. I always considered myself a king's kid. So as I matured and grew older, I attended a predominantly white college. I graduated, got married, and had 4 children of my own. I watched as my children matriculated through the public schools with far too many of their experiences still tainted by racism, as mine had been a generation earlier. The difference was that racism at this point had taken a more stealthy turn. It was no longer acknowledged as part of our national ideology and discourse as it had been when I was growing up. And this made it in many ways more difficult to address than it had been during my youth. By the time my children entered the school system, society had become colorblind. Mainstream America was of the opinion that the initiatives of the civil rights era had effectively eradicated institutionalized racism, and we were post-racial. So why can't people just get over it? The fact that prejudice and racism was no longer as openly recognized as it had been actually did make it more difficult to address. Current events show that racism is still alive, and very well, unfortunately, in our country as well as in the rest of the world. So I accept a moral and historic imperative as a mother, as an educator, and as a member of my society. I accept personal responsibility to try to help to fashion a better, safer, happier world for all of us. No one person, no one race, no one arm or branch of the government can take us to this better place single-handedly. We have to figure out how to go there together as participants in social institutions, as members of our communities, but first as individuals. Many of us would say that we don't do racist things, at least not intentionally, hopefully not openly. And some of us would go even further to say that we have friends and colleagues that cross all ethnic boundaries. But I'm of the opinion that to say that we are not a part of the problem is no longer enough. I believe that we're called to a higher responsibility, to move beyond passive acknowledgement of the problem and to move toward active solutions. I believe that each of us has the capacity to contribute to a more humanitarian world in many very practical and effective ways, one of which is growing racial and cultural empathy. Leo Tolstoy says everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. So my question today is, are you willing to change yourself? How deep, how far, how wide is your commitment to social change and social justice? If we can all agree that there's a problem, first of all, if we can next agree that we are the ones who need to address that problem, and then if we can move in the direction of growing racial and cultural empathy, I believe we can make positive change in the world. Now, I'll share just a few recommendations from my perspective to help get that process started. My first recommendation: get out of your comfort zone. Extend the limits of your current relationships to include people that you don't know, people that you probably would not have associated with unless it was a deliberate effort. The more we get to know about each other, the more we find out that we're alike. A high school classmate of mine posted a status to Facebook that I thought was just really a wonderful description of the concept of growing racial and cultural empathy. He shared briefly about his visit with a black friend of his to a barber shop. How simple is that? He spent the afternoon hanging out with one of his buddies at a barber shop. He laughed a lot. He learned a lot. So much so that he decided he was going to invite his buddy to come with him to his barber shop. Simple, but beautiful in its simplicity, I think. Once we do this, once we extend our borders and begin to enter into different spaces and different places, we open our minds to the process of reconsideration. We are in a position now to think about the viewpoints and beliefs of someone who is different from ourselves, not for the purpose of judging that person, but for the purpose of understanding how they think and why they respond in the way that they respond. There was a Fox 10 News video that told the story of a black minister and activist who took part in the Shoot or Don't Shoot training sponsored by the Maricopa County, Arizona Police Department. They took him with him on a series of patrol simulations, I guess you would say. And he was able to see the threat of violence from the other side. So it changed his thinking. Just imagine what the police might have learned had they done the same thing. Once we reconsider, we're in a position to adjust our thinking. And if we have those relationships that we develop through the first stages, where we can talk to people about the hard questions, where we can talk not just about race, but about racism, then we can begin to open up our eyes and our minds to new ways of seeing, and we can open our hearts to new ways of being. Another Facebook post was shared by a woman who had been previously of the opinion that saying Black Lives Matter was a divisive thing. After spending time speaking with her close black friends, she was able to see a different perspective. She learned that saying Black Lives Matter did not mean that other lives don't. She also was reminded of the historic reality that Black lives have not mattered in the same way that other lives have in America. So she was able to readjust by simply looking at it from someone else's viewpoint. Once we adjust, after we have learned, after we have gotten out and we have learned about other people's perspectives, we are in a position then to critique. At this point, we want to think deeply about these new narratives. Think deeply and analyze them. But not only the newer narratives, think deeply also about the narratives that we have always accepted as truth without questioning them. Political narratives, cultural narratives, even media narratives. Think about certain pictures, images, certain words. What do they imply and what do they evoke from people? Consider the silencing power that is put into effect when you say things like angry black man, pulling the race card, thug. These statements in and of themselves are demonstrations of power. they immediately silence and discredit the voices of those people who are trying to share their perspective with the world. So consider the power of these narratives as we use them. Once we have given head and heart to these new narratives, we're in a position to express ourselves, and this is vital. Speak out. Speak out against racism. We speak out every day against bullying. We train our children how to respond to bullying in school. Should we not provide the perfect example for them by speaking out against racism? After all, racism is bullying too. In the end, my recommendation boils down to this. We must resensitize ourselves to racism. We must not tolerate, ignore, or excuse it. We must become conscious of the many ways in which we have all, every one of us, been damaged by racism. Growing racial and cultural empathy is simply living out an ideology of true human dignity and worth. As we go forward to fight this battle against racism, I recommend that we keep gRaCE in our toolkit, in our first aid kit. And I would liken it to an antibacterial ointment that we spread over the wound to kill the infection so that the healing can begin. Empathy, sharing someone else's feelings, is the first step toward the change that the human race so desperately needs to see. I believe that if we can all commit ourselves to individual change, we can approach this world that Martin Luther King spoke of 51 years ago. We can move toward this happier, safer place that we all said that we would like to live in. I'd like to end with a quote that you're probably familiar with by Mahatma Gandhi. He said, "Be the change that you wish to see in the world." Ideological? Yes. Impossible? Only if we refuse to change. Thank you.